Hello and welcome to Sustain, the podcast of Na'arafetu Center for Climate, Biodiversity, and Society. I'm Maria Armoudian. In this hour, is there a coming water crisis, locally and globally? On 29th of May, our expert panel discussed the biggest issues we are facing, both today and in the future, with ensuring we have clean, potable water. With us is Dame Juliet Gerrard. She's a professor of biological science and has served as the chief science advisor for 3 prime ministers in New Zealand. Professor Naresh Singhal also joins us. He's a professor of civil and environmental engineering and the director of the Water Research Center at the University of Auckland. Dan Hikuroa is Associate Professor of Maori Studies. He is an expert in weaving together Indigenous knowledge and Western science. And finally, postdoctoral fellow Dr. Filippo Verre joins us from Lund University. He is an expert in water politics and water diplomacy.
I want to start with Dame Juliet Gerrard, who studies all kinds of sustainability issues and human health issues. She's been the chief science advisor for the prime minister several years in a row. How many years? 6 years. So that was 3 prime ministers? Yeah, 3 prime ministers. So not only is she like an extraordinary scientist, but now I would give her a PhD in political science too. So, which is kind of what your book's going to be, right? Yeah, it's really fantastic. So, and then Naresh Singhal, who is in the engineering department, studies water contamination and the engineering solutions that are around that as well. And full professor there, both these 2 full professors, really. And then we've got a special guest, Filippo Verre, who comes to us from Lund University. He's a fellow there, and he studies the politics of water, and it really looks into both, water as a cudgel, like people, using it as a political weapon, but also water as diplomacy. So it's kind of this really interesting transdisciplinary, or multidisciplinary, I should say, panel. So I thought we should start right here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, with Dame Gerrard, Juliet Gerrard. If you could kind of start us with what are the big looming crises that we're facing here with our water. I mean, we've got this abundant water in this country. We're one of the luckiest countries in the world with the kind of richness of it all. But it seems like we're facing some problems. Would you say that's an understatement?
Yeah, kia ora koutou, and thank you, Maria, for the generous introduction, which neatly covers off the fact I'm not a water expert. But it was the topic that was on my mind in my last meeting with PM Luxon. So one of the things that he asked me was, what would you advise me to get your successor to work on? And I had a short list of things, and top of my list was water, just because I think there are so many risks in so many different dimensions that aren't fully appreciated across government. I saw a cartoon the other day, which I think sums up the problem quite well. So it's someone being advised not to jump off a skyscraper, and then they jump, and the cartoon catches them halfway down. And the thought bubble says, I feel fine so far. And I think that it's making a general point about short-term thinking in a world with long-term problems, but I think it's particularly appropriate for water. And the reason it was probably on my mind when I talked to the PM was we just had the cryptosporidium outbreak in Queenstown. And so I'd been talking to lots of people with water expertise, particularly drinking water safety. And they said something that really stuck with me, which was, thank goodness it was crypto, not cyanobacteria. And I said, talk me through that. And they said, well, you can't boil your way out of a cyanobacteria outbreak. So far, New Zealand's had a few scares which have been widely publicised, and some really terrible waterborne disease outbreaks, like the one in Havelock North. And the one in Queenstown, we all kind of shrugged our shoulders like it was normal and went, meh, we'll just have to boil the water. But not every microbe that enters the water supply would you be able to boil. So there's a looming public health crisis and no real confidence in the system that we've got multiple barriers of protection. So most people turn on the tap in urban centres most days, and it might taste a bit funny, but the water's safe. But in New Zealand, almost 1 million people aren't necessarily always using reticulated water. And the safety nets for our rural water supplies are weak. And so if one thing fails, a chlorine pump fails, you can suddenly have an outbreak of microbial disease. So that was top of the list of things I was fretting about. But beyond that, there's also chemical contamination of the water. Looming really poorly understood threats around things like microplastics and antimicrobial resistance, which Naresh will no doubt talk about. And then the other big problem I think that water really exemplifies well is that people see things through one lens when something like water needs to be seen through many. So people will say there's too much nitrate in the water and we're all going to get bowel cancer. Maybe we will, maybe we won't. And maybe there's a correlation and maybe there isn't. The data's uncertain. But if you were trying to solve the problem of bowel cancer, you wouldn't start with nitrate in the water. You might eat fewer bacon sandwiches or not be obese or not drink too much alcohol. And if you were worrying about fresh water quality and nitrates in it, you would be more concerned about what it's doing to the environment. And I think we have a problem that people that do latch on to the issue of water and try and publicise it can use the wrong lens. So if you're trying to fight nitrate with a health scare, you will be undermined immediately by someone pointing out that that's an uncertain evidence base. So we don't tend to look at problems holistically and ponder them for a long time. So that's probably enough for me.
Well, actually, I do have one more question for you, and then we'll pass it around. And that is, how I know that we have a huge problem with these microbes in New Zealand, like bigger than many other countries. Why? Why is it this bad here in a clean, green country like New Zealand?
Well, one is we have to be careful not to catastrophize because we're the worst country that measures carefully.
I got it.
So I'm sure there's worse countries that don't document, and I'm sure we don't document every case of diarrhea. So for people with a bit of data, and we don't have enough data, and if you'd like some really good deep thinking on that, watch a webinar by Alison Collins from the Aotearoa Circle that was on yesterday, which was fantastic. She's got some really sensible ways to address the problems. So one of the problems is we've got more data than the places that are worse. One of the problems is we've got an infrastructure deficit with a small population country spread over a large area. And the basic she'll be right attitude. I think. So people haven't changed the filter and someone hasn't filled the chlorine, and you would like a nice Swiss cheese multi-barrier model of safety, and actually we're down to one slice and there's a hole in it. So I think there's a cultural piece, and I think there's a lack of pressure from people to politicians to safeguard water, because for most of us on most days it's fine, and we don't have deep conversations about our risk appetite for it not being fine tomorrow.
Thank you. Dan Hikuroa, can I turn to you now and ask you the same question, which is, what are the biggest issues and why do we have them?
Kind of hard to follow a magnificent answer like that. But I'll stick to the things that I know, and it's a woeful underinvestment in the infrastructure. But I would go even deeper than that. I'd say actually it's the conceptual framing that underpins that infrastructure that maybe we could question. What do I mean by that? The idea that we can just pump our pollution into rivers, which used to be best practice 20, 30, maybe a bit more, maybe 40, 50 years ago. And now we treat it, but we still pump it into receiving environments. And so we have this network of pipes, and we expect the water, as you say, Juliet, to come on when we turn the tap on, and when we flush it away, it goes somewhere, and we expect that that's being dealt with. That has been underinvested in, and so that's not working properly probably half of the time, and that's not Dan saying that, that's coming from the Water NZ conference last year, and that's pretty much universally agreed, that the infrastructure is failing, but I'd say it's based on the wrong premise. It's based on the idea that water is a commodity, that water is something we just take for granted and do certain things to. And for a long time, we've been able to do that, and we've just got by. And I think Juliet makes a really good point that for most of the time, for most of us, water behaves in a way in which we expect it to. It comes out of the tap, we can flush it. But I can tell you when we had that deluge in Auckland a few years back, and suddenly the water supply went down, people panicked. And it's not trying to catastrophize, but it's trying to say, we could have planned for this, and we could have planned for this a whole lot better, but we chose not to. And these things cost money, but also if we reframed it, and so instead of treating our rivers as toilets, let's treat them like taonga. Let's think about some ancestral ways of relating with water as something we treasure, that we revere. At the moment, the way we deal with rain falling on roofs and roads is to try and funnel it into pipes as quick as we can and then get it somewhere else. What if we said, hey, that's a treasure. How might we look at stormwater, for example? Let's revere it. We can actually, and it's great to see that. See some of the recent builds on this campus, that's been exactly the ethos that's been taken on, that rainwater was caught, rainwater has been recycled and used in various facilities throughout the buildings. And so I think there's these different conceptual framings that we can start to bring into the infrastructure picture. Now, this isn't just some sort of dream state. This is actually happening, like I say, in the buildings. If we go to Hobsonville Point, not perfect, but the low-impact design, the water-sensitive design, the kind of spongy city design there, worked and performed pretty well during the deluges in 2023. And so it's kind of taking these ancestral ways of knowing and being and doing, and then trying to apply that thinking and looking at, hey, we're already doing some of it. It's the 20% of the time, 15% of the time where we're not doing it, which is where a lot of the problem is coming, which is where I'd say maybe we could bring in some of those ideas of treating water as a taonga and have that reflected in new builds and in all our new water infrastructure, because we can't change it all overnight because that's just practically impossible. But we are changing pipes and updating things every single day. So let's get the conceptual framing right and then have the new way of replacing things with water as a taonga as opposed to water as a commodity or a toilet or something.
When you first came in today, you mentioned that the government just released a document about the future of water here in New Zealand, and I think you said you had a chance of skimming it. What do you want us to know about that?
Okay. So in the last, and excuse me, it'll be slightly technical, but I promise I'll try and bring it up. We had something called the National Policy Statement on Freshwater Management, which is a guide on how we should be thinking about water, mainly for regional councils for whom the responsibility of water lay. And the framing reflected a taonga approach. It said the first right of the water is to be water and to be fresh, and the first right of a river is to be a river. And then once we've got that taken care of, then it's the right of people to enjoy water for their health and well-being. And then after that, we can enjoy it for industrial and for commercial purposes. The beauty of that is, if we take care of water and keep its intrinsic qualities intact, then all those other two flow naturally on from it. The newly proposed, or the kind of the reverting what used to be in place, was, no, we just need to balance the needs of the water and the river alongside the economic and the social and the kind of needs, which on paper is kind of, you think, oh, that's fair. But what happens is it's usually the economic and the industrial and the commercial imperatives which overrule and which overpower. And by not having the water having a right to be fresh water and the river having a right to be a water come first, it means that when councils give out consents for people to pull water out, they'll naturally give too many. And this has happened in many places. And this is crazy. In one place, they gave out too many consents. They said, oh, actually, the river, it will never run dry because they never give out that many, but it will run below, which is healthy for the river. Their proposal wasn't the rational thing, which is to say, we gave too many out, can we just ask for 5-10% back from everyone? Their proposal was, let's drill to that river over there and suck that one dry. So that's what happens when we start having this balance. It's never a balance. The river and the water always loses.
When we come back to you, I also want to talk about giving rivers rights. But I think we should turn to Naresh first. Naresh, you study all kinds of contaminants. What do you see in your research? And how did we get here? And what do we need to do?
I can talk about two types of contaminants, very broadly speaking. One are biological contaminants, and other are chemicals. And both of them pose huge concerns. I'll first touch upon the biological contaminants, and Juliet talked about the cryptosporidium, and then Dan talked about some of the chemical aspects. And we've got some unique problems in New Zealand, so I want to touch upon that. And we've got a lot of water. And we're people who are heavily connected to water. So it's that combination. So first I'll talk about antimicrobial resistance. And when we talk about antimicrobial resistance, I think oftentimes we think about antibiotics and antibiotics overuse with humans and with animals. But I think there is a bigger problem with antibiotics in the environment. It's not antibiotics, it's actually antibiotic resistance microorganisms. And it's a problem because of changes that are beyond our control, things like global warming, things like what we're adding to these sinks. Basically, everything is accumulating in our water bodies. And these are having changes that none of us understand. This is something that UN, WHO acknowledged that we need to consider animal health, water health, and environmental health. This framework that goes by the name of One Health, to understand this problem, which is multifaceted. But the biggest link that is missing is actually the environmental health. We really do not know what it's doing. Now, why I'm fascinated with that is that in the little time that we have spent looking at this and looking at the little data that we have, it seems to be of concern. Looking at the future, people talk about by 2050, maybe annually you have about 10 million deaths. That's the same as the number of deaths that you get from cancer. The amount of effect that you see in terms of cost is anywhere from 1 trillion, not billion, 1 trillion to $3 trillion. Now, these are enormous numbers. And the reason partly we don't talk about that is we do not know how to go about managing it. So I'll give an example of the Avon River in Canterbury, and it has E. coli that are resistant to one of the drugs of last resort. Now, and they see that very frequently. That's not the problem by itself. The thing is that it is resistant to this particular antibiotic up to 30 times the concentration that you can safely administer. Now, if the resistance is not going to kill you, I think then the application of medicine is certainly going to kill you, so go for it. So where I'm coming with this is that when you look at the things that affect the water quality, that affect the emergence of these antibiotic resistance microorganisms, have to do a lot with pollutants that we add. Not just antibiotics, but also non-antibiotic drugs that we are discharging. And we have a problem with our wastewater treatment plants, which are one of the biggest sources of the discharge of these contaminants. Now we know maybe about half our plants are operating without consent. About 70% of them will come up for renewal. We know that the costs are enormous. And so we had to change the entire program when the government changed. So we have some major challenges. And that's really the problem. A big issue is that we do not understand, and it hasn't quite received the sort of recognition that you would need to make these changes are. And the last problem is we don't have a solution. We are still trying to understand the problem. We really do not know. Once you understand the problem, what are you going to do about it? Is the problem in terms of improving your treatment plants, and if so, what? Will each plant have a membrane system? Or what's the solution? Will that be sufficient? We do not understand that. So obviously, the first step is getting more data and understanding what the issue is. And that comes to biological and chemical contaminants. And with chemical contaminants, we have the same issue. We typically tend to target the contaminants we want, but unless you can do this in a very broad way, you cannot explore the linkages between contaminants that are present but not yet subject of focus between them and these antibiotic resistance microorganisms that we're seeing. So that's the problem, that's the challenge that we face in New Zealand.
So I'm a political scientist, so I see everything through the lens of politics, meaning that politics can mitigate these problems, it can define the problems, and it can fail. It can let it continue on. So I want to sort of turn first to New Zealand politics and then look abroad. Perhaps, Juliet, you could speak to this a little bit in terms of, this is what governments are supposed to mitigate. What's going on?
I'll disagree slightly with one thing that Naresh said, which is that we don't know how to solve the problem, because technically I think we do. And that webinar I mentioned that I'd recommend had 5 steps to solve the problem. So I'll try and remember them. I've got my notebook if I forget one. One was monitor. So we need to work out what to monitor and gather the data. One was make sure when we do that, we do it in a standardized way and that data sets are interoperable, because at the moment they're all gathered on someone's Excel spreadsheet in a drawer somewhere, and we're not getting all the information out of them. Then the third one was turn that data into insights and knowledge so that we can focus on the whole problem and understand what's getting better, what's getting worse, and prioritize action. Work out what's working and scale it and develop it. And the last one was future insights. So look forward over the horizon, which will be where the AMR came in and the uncertainty maybe came up. So none of this is rocket science. We could really do a lot to mitigate the risks of disease and contamination, but what's failed is the politics, as you point out. So I think it's a failure of politics, not of technical understanding.
And so what's going on there that you can shed light on?
Well, I think it's the short-term thinking. So I think, like the guy jumping off the building, we all feel okay today. I think individuals tend to think in the short term, at least where I come from, and that we could learn a lot from cultures where 7 generations is a normal way to think. That would help. And of course, then in democracies in particular, we're electing governments that are responding to what we want, and we tell our politicians that what we want is short-term solutions. And that's entirely understandable. If you're a politician, you're going to have to deal with the cyclone, not say, sorry, I'm just like dealing with this data issue for water quality for the next 10 years. And so, I mean, I've seen those people in the building, they are working hard, and most of them are there for the right reasons and are dealing with things that are coming at them very fast. So we don't create the time and space within the political environment to solve the problems, and we don't invest in long-term institutions or resource them or empower them well enough to hold those politicians to account. So imagine if we had a parliamentary commissioner for the environment who could decide and the government had to enact it. So to take it out of democratic political tussle and put it somewhere else.
Or maybe a deliberative democracy model.
That might be a way to get there. I know someone who could help with that. But I'm going to hand to the politics person because I'm not a politician.
Yeah. Yes, and just before we go international, would it make a difference, Dan Hikuroa, if we gave all rivers and water bodies personhood rights?
It could. And the reason I didn't come out kind of going, yes, we need to do that, is the cases where that's happened make a lot of sense in those cases. We don't want to assume that it will work everywhere. I think it has the potential to absolutely do that. What I would instead, to respond to that, is to echo the words of one of the mayors from nearby to Queenstown at the Water New Zealand conference last year, when asked about his relationship with Māori. He said categorically, if Māori had been in charge, the water would be in the most pristine state and we would be all generating value from it in the best ways possible.
Well, let's look internationally. Filippo Verre, you've been studying how water's been both used as a weapon and as a tool of diplomacy. Give us the bigger picture and the globe on water politics.
Thank you, Maria, for first of all for having me. Water diplomacy, where to begin? I will give you 2 examples, one positive and one negative, of how water is often weaponized, so used as a tool to create problems and tensions, and another one positive example that makes us reflect on how water can be used as a tool that fosters cooperation. I'm sure everybody knows about the Russian-Ukraine war. What if I told you that partially this war is a water war? Do you know? Anybody knows anything about it? The southern front of the war is a water war. So imagine behind me the picture of the Ukraine and Crimea. Crimea used to be a Ukrainian land, of course. During the 70s, the Soviets built the North Crimean Canal that was supposed to bring water from Ukraine through the Dnipro River, very, very important river, all the way through Crimea, which is in theory a very, very arid peninsula. So Russia takes Crimea 2014. The reaction of Ukraine is to build a dam that stops the water flow from Ukraine to Crimea. This creates several water crises in Crimea for several years. In fact, it's not a coincidence that few hours, I would say, after the invasion of Russia, the Spetsnaz, which you know are the special forces of Russia, invaded the southern front to destroy the dam that was blocking the water flow from Ukraine to Crimea. We don't know much about it, but the water war the water factor is very relevant in that part of the world and in the Ukrainian-Russian war. I'm sure you heard about the Kakhovka Dam that was a sort of ecocide. In this case, there was a bomb that destroyed the Kakhovka Dam that created an artificial flood. So this, of course, is an example of how water can be used as a weapon, back and forth, so by the Ukrainians to create problems to the Russians in Crimea and vice versa. There are several examples. I chose to focus on this briefly today because maybe we don't know much about it. I'm sure many of you know about the potential crisis and even a water war between Egypt and Ethiopia with a big dam. Water is often used as a tool to create tensions between nations which are transboundary, so which share water bodies, meaning lakes, rivers, but also aquifers. Aquifers are also a very important aspect, not often considered, actually often neglected by experts and professors. But there are also positive examples. I'm at the moment focusing, I'm doing my research on my second book, which is about the Himalayan confluence, I call it like this. It's a very interesting water cooperation between India, Nepal, and Bhutan. These three nations in Asia managed to have a very important water cooperation, trying to exploit the kinetic force of the water in that very important steep mountains, to create hydropower and to ensure constant water flow downstream to India. How is this cooperation made? Basically, India is financing 90% of the projects upstream, meaning in Nepal and in Bhutan, receiving a lot of positive impacts, which is the constant water flow for the agricultural purposes, and even more importantly, hydropower generation, both from Bhutan and Nepal. So there are many examples. There are also positive cases of water cooperation. My project in Lund University is exactly about this. I work in water cooperation in the Middle East. Spoiler, there is not so much water nor cooperation in the Middle East. But at least this we have to try to understand if things are possible. But I want to focus on the positive aspects. There are cases of cooperation. The Indian, Nepalese and Bhutanese case is a very good one. I invite you to do a little bit more research, dig on your own, because you can find everything online, and it's very interesting. And it's a case of how water is going to be a positive factor between nations. And it's not just always tension and always problems. It can be also some cooperation.
Thanks so much. I want to open it up to the room to see if there are questions also. Anybody who want to ask any question to anybody on the panel? And while you're thinking of your question, I'm going to ask one more, which is about climate change. Naresh, you mentioned it, but perhaps all of us need to think about the effects of climate change on the future of our water.
Everything's just going to get worse, put simply. So, I mean, a lot of the problems we have with our stormwater and wastewater are exaggerated because it's all dependent on rainfall and sudden rainfall, and that's what we are almost guaranteed to get more of. So I think was it 3,000 overflow events last year, and then it just goes up every year. So if we don't want to treat the water as a toilet, then we're going to need to fix things fast.
Dan Hikuroa, you also have talked about this and these massive floods and what they're doing to all of our waterways.
Yeah, and I'll focus more on waterways. Once again, we brought in ideas from other countries of transforming landscapes and then making rivers behave, and then seeing wetlands as places of undesirable places. So we tried to drain wetlands, we tried to produce arable land, we tried to get rivers to behave in sensible ways, i.e. not moving at all. And that may have worked for a time, but we've probably been seeing in the last 20, 30, maybe even 40 years that it's not working anymore. And tragically, in the last few years, we've seen thousands of houses flooded on areas of land that are referred to as floodplains. And spoiler alert, it's in the name. It's a flat piece of land that floods. And so maybe it might be reasonable to expect that if you buy a house that it's not going to be subjected to something like that. But sadly, it's not. And so the sooner we stop trying to get rivers to behave, and the sooner we stop putting our infrastructure in harm's way, because as Juliet says, the floods are going to get bigger, the better. And the engineers will say, we can always build bigger stop banks, and they're always terrific until they're not. And then we're more vulnerable than we were without the stop banks. And so myself and others, including John in the room, we've published a lot of research saying, hey, we need to make room for rivers. When rivers flood, that's just a river being a river, and it's probably our fault for putting our stuff in the way. So we can't change the past, but we can certainly change the future.
Filippo and then Naresh.
Yes, I was mentioning earlier the role of the aquifers. Climate change is going to have an impact in, of course, the decrease of rainfall. I will give you an example. Yemen, everybody knows about Yemen, very far away from here, but is on a verge of a climate crisis. Very, very important, very important. We think that is a war-induced crisis because partially it's true, because the few water power plants, desalination plants, wastewater treatment plants are under attack, or water is weaponized, so they are destroyed, so there isn't a big infrastructure there. But the problem is that, for example, the use of aquifers in Yemen has not been approached sustainably. We need to think about the fact that Yemen is really, really in bad shape, and it's not a problem related nor with climate nor with war. It's a human factor. The human factor is really relevant also in the case of Yemen. There are illegal wells that drills, and they take a lot of water from aquifers that used to have a lot of fossil water in the aquifers of Yemen. Nowadays the situation is very complicated because these illegal wells have withdrawn a lot of water, and there is very little water in the aquifer. And in the case of Yemen, very arid country, no rainfall, no rivers. There isn't a perennial river. There are only ephemeral rivers in Yemen. No rivers, no rainfall, not even water in the aquifer. It's the recipe of disaster, but mostly human cost, because in Yemen they use a lot of water for the cat cultivation. I don't know if anybody knows about cat. Cat is a sort of drug that is illegal in most countries, at least in the Western world, in Europe, in the US, Canada, I think in New Zealand as well. It's a recreational plant that has no nutritional value. Apparently it gives people who ingest this plant the effect of being drunk. So they cannot drink that much because it's a Muslim country. So they recreate like this. There is no problem with that. The problem is that they use a lot of water. This water is not used to produce food, but to have recreational. So it's a circle of negativity. So probably in the coming months or in the coming years, you will notice that Yemen is going to have a tremendous water-related crisis, because there isn't water, unfortunately, not even in the aquifers of Yemen. So it's climate change related, but also we shouldn't
it's also misuse related, like it is everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. So.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Naresh.
So there's a saying that the effects of climate change are perceived through water. and a lot of my colleagues are talking about too much, too little, but we forget about heat. You will have water in the wrong places, and you will have flooding in some of the places where you don't want it, and drought in others, and the effects are compounded by the increase in temperatures and perhaps your fires, and you need water for putting out fires, but you don't get that. So there's a compounding of effects. It's just that the frequency and intensity of this change, which is something that it's the frequency and intensity of the change that's the problem. It's about the risk that we face and the uncertainties this change is bringing. That's what it is, So we are basing our infrastructure based on the best estimates. What if we exceed those? What happens then? What happens if you have leakages that lead to infiltration of contaminants into drinking water systems? And do we go back to doing things the way we do in India, where every house has its own filtration system, which consists of a UV with a filter, carbon filter, and basically mimicking the treatment plant at small scale? And you then have a RO system, reverse osmosis system on top of that. So you basically got a mini water treatment system in your house. Where do we draw the line? That's really the issue. And then the cost for managing it. So it's all of those things that are really worrisome.
I see a microphone in Fabio's hand.
Yeah, okay. The premise is that I don't know anything about water. I'm a political economist that looks at political violence. But I like to... Maybe you can elucidate a little bit more about the politics of water in New Zealand. You mentioned if the Maori were in power, we would all benefit and the water will be crystal clear and all the rest. Well, you said that there's generally like short-sightedness and short-term sort of vision. But I wonder if you could expand a little bit whether there's any difference in how at least the two main parties in New Zealand relate to water-related problems.
I wasn't particularly enamoured with the Three Waters solution, nor am I particularly enamoured with the local water done well solution, fundamentally because they both see water as this commodity. It's still that 18th century thinking. I'd rather them see water as a cycle. I'd rather see the water infrastructure as part of the water cycle, and to shift that thinking in. One could argue that it's an ideological shift, that it's because it's Māori, they don't like it. That's an argument that some might make. I think we can remove that by saying, actually, it's an argument that makes the best sense. If we see ourselves as part of the water cycle and then see how can we do our engineering to mimic and work with the water cycle and alongside it, we're going to be better placed.
Okay, I see a microphone being held right here. What's your name?
Hi, my name is Marco, and I'm in philosophy at Auckland Uni. I just wanted to pick up on something even before the previous ask of questions, but it connects to that. So then you said, if I got that right, if Māori were in charge, our waters would be in the most pristine condition. Does that just about state correctly?
That's what the mayor said, yeah.
Okay, and you agree with that?
I think the condition of the water, where it would be the river and the quality comes first, and then everything else that needs it to operate, including the economy and including for agriculture, including for irrigation, would flow from that, yes.
Yeah. So I was just curious, and I mean this is purely grounded in sympathetic curiosity. So given that we all operate within a capitalist framework, right? So we're all subject to the same pressures and incentives, unfortunately, power, money, wealth, and so on. So whether you're an indigenous institution or individual or not, right, you are heavily incentivized in those unfortunate ways, which makes me wonder, we know that indigenous groups have engaged in unfortunate practices, unsustainable forestry, and so on, which seem to be falling prey to unfavorable incentives. So that is why I was wondering if you could say a little bit more why we would be so confident that if Māori were in charge, our waters really would be in such pristine conditions. Do we have sufficient grounds for such confidence?
My perspective would be that that's a proxy for if we had a long-term view. And it's not just in New Zealand that argument's made, it's all over the world. So Indigenous peoples tend to think multi-generationally, and so for long problems, that's a perspective that's likely to work. So I don't want to put words in Dan's mouth, but I think if the people in charge had a long-term, multi-generational view, we would be better off. And I don't mind who they are, but if I look around New Zealand for people with that perspective, they tend to be in Māori communities, not in Pākehā communities. So I think it's a proxy that's easily politicised, but it's based on some wisdom that we need that long-termism. And I ducked the previous question about the two main parties. I think they have different rhetoric, and I think they have different intentions. And individuals within each have different thirsts for evidence. That's not necessarily party political, but some parties have more commitment to evidence-based solutions than others. But I don't think either party can make any progress in 3 years. It's just not a problem that can be fixed in 3 years. And if they go all guns blazing and try to, they fail and get voted out. Yeah. And so I don't think we can solve it within a 3-term political cycle. I think we need a longer solution. I think there's various ways to express that, and if Māori were in charge, is a proxy for what shouldn't be a political football, but should be a call for long-term thinking.
I just want to respond to, because I think I know what you're getting at as well, that there are some groups that have engaged in sort of that intensified capitalism in their businesses. That's different from the indigenous knowledge, ways of thinking that I think Dan was speaking to. And I suppose that most Maori are not doing that, what he's talking about, the intensification of the capital, the intensified farming and the intensified forestry. There's just a handful, I think, that are. I call it a colonization of consciousness. It is that capitalism coming in and sort of colonizing even, these ancient, really beautiful ways of seeing the world.
If you care to take a look at Wakatoa Corporation and what they're doing in their 1,000-year vision, or if you care to take a look at the Tuaropaki Trust and what they're doing, they've certainly got the long-term vision in mind in their operations, and they're fully part of the capital system that we operate in. But they're operating to be good ancestors so that those in the future can derive the benefits.
Yeah, thank you.
Good evening all. My name is Rahul. I'm a PhD student at the School of Engineering here. I've studied climate policy prior to studying for my PhD here. My question is to all of you, because I believe all of you are well positioned to think what I'm thinking and perhaps critically analyze it for me. One technology that has come up again in the focus is carbon capture. And thank you. Now, if I relate it to the panel discussion that we're having today, what does it entail for water in New Zealand and the wider planet that we live on? Thank you.
Who's starting? Naresh, do you want, or do you want?
I get the hard question. So I think that, the two issues are connected, but it's a long way between them, so it's hard to give a quick soundbite. There are those in the world that say technology will save us, and those that are deeply skeptical that it will. I sit somewhere in between. If we had a huge global push to invest in carbon capture technology and deployed it wisely, and we could reverse some of the greenhouse gas concentrations that we've already locked in, you might be able to mitigate some of the impact of climate and what that means for water. But that's a big ask. The technology's pretty early, the investment's pretty light, and a lot of it's quite speculative. So even though there's some promising tech out there, the chance of it being scaled and deployed across the globe on the scale that we'd need seems small to me. So I would put my hopes on some quite dull policy and regulation changes and some long-term infrastructure investment ahead of carbon capture tech to solve these problems.
So, when you're young, and I'm an engineer, so, you tend to think technology is a solution to everything, and then you learn something better. It's only a part of the solution, and perhaps there are other things like policy and perhaps human behavior and changing how people view things. I think the problem lies in that we view things differently. And we don't value the change. If we really value the change, I think we could bring about the change. But we can't agree on the metrics, and we can't agree on how we do that, and we can't agree on how much investment needs to be made. And that's part of the problem. That's not a technological problem. That's actually a much bigger problem. So the problem and the solutions probably lie in a slightly different space than engineering. But what we do is we provide some enablers that can, if the will is there, they can perhaps get you started. And that's about it. So that's sort of my view.
What's your name?
I'm Nicola. I work at the university and I've done some environmental science study. My question observation is that it's a pollution problem, right? We don't want our water to be polluted. At a very simple level, we are importing tons of plastic every year, and some of that's got half-life of 500 years or more, and yet we are continuing to increase our importation of a whole lot of materials that we know are going to be around, and a lot of them it's like single use, put them in the tip, and they're going to be polluting for generations, but we don't put the cost of the future generation dealing with it on the import and the price that we pay for it. Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, we did a big project on plastics. That was probably one of our more successful ones, as judged by the fact that lots of recommendations were accepted and the policies were implemented, and it was not turned around completely when the government changed. So the pace has slowed, but the direction didn't change. So we did see some movement in the right direction, but too little, too late. No, it's not just plastics, but it's a good example. And so digging into that project, you begin to realize how hard it is. So you can say, let's stop importing plastic, and then think about your everyday life and think just how hard it is. So we did manage to get some removed. So expanded polystyrene is hard to find now. So you used to, 10 years ago, get your burger in one of those horrible floaty clam things. That took 3 years to get rid of. That was a really good lesson for me, from obvious idea to implementation, because you have to make sure that all the people selling burgers have something else to put the burger in that doesn't go all soggy so the burger falls on your lap. And isn't covered in PFAS. So just that one single example shows you how hard it is. So massive problem to solve. I went to a conference in Rapa Nui, Easter Island, to talk to all the people around the Pacific at a conversation they had about marine pollution ahead of the UN conference, which failed to solve the plastic problem globally so far. And they took us to the beach. So they're in the middle of the South Pacific Gyre, and it looks like a beautiful beach. But when you get to the beach, a huge chunk of it is microplastic. And we were literally helping them sieve it out to get an understanding of the problem. So massive problem globally, needs a global solution. And when you try and do what you can do within one country, it's so slow. So, I'm happy because we swapped the burger clams. That's not going to save the planet. But we need that political will all over the world, on every single pollutant. And it's a massive challenge. Yeah.
I'd like to respond to the guy that I don't see here anymore. He asked about technology. We live in amazing times. I think many things are possible. Technology can really support us. Naresh earlier was talking about water leakages. I think the main strategy, the main approach would be and could be to reduce as much as possible water leakages. I say this because Maria knows, and I have a think tank and a company. We are involved in several projects internationally, one of which being, for example, trying to reduce water leakages in Turkish aqueducts. I checked the data in New Zealand. You guys are pretty in good shape in this regard, because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but the water leakages on average in New Zealand aqueducts is between 30 and 40%, something like that. On average, in Mediterranean basin is way higher. In Turkey, for example, it's between 50 and 55%. In certain parts of Italy, southern parts, is even more than 60%. So water is there. We need to try to reduce the water leakages. How can we do that? Using technology, artificial intelligence, softwares, etc. This is already an opportunity, something that is already being done. Our project is trying to use artificial intelligence, especially algorithms and machine learning, Internet of Things, to try to predict the water leakages in which part of the aqueducts will be. Because the problem is that once we understand that there is a leakage, it can pass like so many weeks, and we are talking about millions of cubic meters of water lost. So we need to not only prevent, but understand rather quickly if we have a water leakage. So it can be done. As you were saying, the investment is enormous. It's very, very important. But nowadays technology can have a positive impact. So yeah.
Hi, I'm Anne Bardsley. I'm mostly working these days on deliberative democracy, and there's a lot that could be touched on from all of those things, from water safety and pollution and supply, which we have done a citizens' assembly on, to water diplomacy. I'm dealing with Australia on that. But I want to ask, it's probably a question for Dan, because I know this is you say it's an attitude change, but we were at a public meeting the other night in Wairau on the North Shore about the room for water and the plan with Auckland Council wanting to create a wetland out of a golf course.
Oh, yes.
And it just, the things that were coming out in the room were interesting, and and it just to me was saying, oh my gosh, this is such a topic for a deliberative assembly. How would you? What would we would call you in and say, what would you say to these people? In that. How do you convince people, even though we're sitting there and they're talking to people in the room whose houses are flooded, who are completely traumatized, and their main focus is still to save a golf course instead of making a wetland out of it? Where do you even start with that argument?
That's a toughie. I was going to say, make sure those people whose houses were impacted, and if they were the very ones in the room, I guess the challenge is that they're not seeing, for whatever reason, whether it's cognitive dissonance or whether it's just, I'm not sure, the link between having a wetland and significantly reducing the risk of flood to their house again in the future. And it's trying to find, it's thinking and behaving like water when it hits an obstacle. What does it do? It either pulls up behind it and forces it over, or it works its way around the side and then wriggles around. I'm not trying to skirt the question, I'm just trying to... An approach that we've had in another community that we've been working that's facing issues of too much water as well as too much human excrement in the water and what have you. And we've had to... Our approach is think like water. Do we knock this one over? Do we go around it? Do we impregnate it and break it down from within? And I suppose, without trying to sound too much like a politician, maybe that's what just has to keep happening, that discussion. To be honest, it astounds me that folks whose houses, and they're severely traumatised from it, don't see that having a wetland upstream of where they live would significantly reduce.
I would clarify, the people who were flooded were probably not pro golf course anymore. There was enough of their community. This is a packed room full of people who, on one side of me, someone saying the golf course, and the other, right on the other side, they're arguing that this is a community thing. They're not. I think you could get there through the assembly. It's that messaging.
And then part of that allies, and just for those who didn't hear, it's folks who were flooded might have been the minority in the room, or when as vociferous. Often it's pitched as a binary. It's this or it's that. I mean, I'm always about and. Why can't we have the golf course and a wetland?
Well, there was an option for that too. That they were saying the council wasn't looking at it.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think it's the approach is think like water and behave like water, and then practically it's trying to get that connect. When we saw it with COVID, you know, we were quite happy for governments to make quite significant decisions on what we could or couldn't do, because our lives and livelihoods we felt them were directly in jeopardy. It's a little bit more tricky for folks whose house might not have been flooded so much. One of the neat things though, Anne, that gives me confidence broadly is that when Auckland was asked following those devastating floods that really crippled our water supply, would we be willing to pay a little bit more in our rates and have it targeted specifically for water, it was a unanimous yes. And so I think we can make good decisions, long-looking future decisions. Sometimes we're weird things.
So we're just about out of time, and I know the jazz is supposed to start in about 3 minutes. And so I just, first of all, want to say thank you, Ngāmihi Nui, for coming. And I want to thank my esteemed panel here. Just wonderful to get to be with you and have this really important conversation. I thank you very much for your time and for your wisdom and for your knowledge and sharing all of that with us. And it wouldn't be an event without you guys being here, so thank you so much for being here. Please give a hand to the panel.